All right, my name is Roy Curless, Curless.
Glad you spelled it because I misspelled it.
Oh, okay.
You had I. I think I did somewhere. Somewhere I had I.
You want to remind her about the eye line to keep
Yeah.
it on YouTube?
Good point. So when you answer the questions, it's tempting to look at these guys, but I want you to just look at me when you answer the questions.
All right.
Okay. So, Roy, how old were you during the 1964 flood? It was 50 years ago.
I was about 33.
Okay. And what were you doing then for a living?
In 64, I was working in the Humboldt County Assessor's Office.
And what do you remember about the 1964 flood?
Just a great big mess. I was here in Ronoville Airport during that weekend, so I knew they had problems, so I went over to the airport and helped wherever I could with the airplanes and the helicopters. And while I was there, I saw them bring the pilot that went down at McCann when they hit the power line. And that was a real tragedy.
It was, yeah. So you remember the airplanes and the helicopters being there. What were the airplanes and helicopters doing out at the Ronoville Airport?
They were flying out of Ronoville Airport. The Bullock boy, Richard Bullock, he was flying his little airplane into Dyerville, landing on the freeway, and then taxiing up to Redcrest. And I remember Gene Rothland, and he was flying into Riddell. I remember, the helicopters and all coming, the Coast Guard, and the helicopters flying off of the Bennington out here that was anchored off the coast here at the mouth of the Eel River.
And were they doing rescue missions? Or
At that time, they were rescuing people, and then later they were hauling fuel and supplies to wherever they could. I helped load some of the 50-gallon barrels of diesel, but what they needed more than the diesel in the barrels were the 5-gallon bucket or 5-gallon cans to carry the diesel to the equipment, because they had no way of rolling those big barrels around. So they really needed 5-gallon cans to move the diesel and gasoline from the barrels to the equipment.
Because they were pretty heavy.
Oh yeah, the 50-gallon barrel weighed 450 pounds, and it was they had no way other than just to empty them into smaller containers to move them.
Do you remember the storms that led up to the flood?
Yes, I do. It was raining. I mean, it was raining bucketfuls, and you could tell, because I can remember back in the 55 flood, how hard it was raining. I was living in Holmes Flat then, and we had the Standard Oil plant at South Fork, which got flooded in the 55 flood. But I can remember that storm hitting, and I thought, boy, we better head for higher ground, because I knew it was going to be a big flood. Well, anyway, when the 64 flood hit, there was water upon water coming in, and I knew that there was really going to be a big flood there, but I didn't realize how hard it was going to hit some of those smaller places.
A lot of people said it was like one of those really warm rainstorms.
Well, first, we had a real cold snap, snow and everything on the ground, and then we had that pineapple connection, which brought in the warm rain, and not only did we have a real cloudburst, but we also had that snow melting, which just added on top of it. And of course, all of these timber areas that, going back to the old split stuff days where they had lots of debris and stuff in these smaller streams, the 55 flood cleaned out part of it, but the 64 flood took twice as much stuff down. And that just plugged the rivers, and of course, washing out the big redwood trees coming down and just tearing the bridges and everything all apart. It was just a horrible scene.
Were you down at Fern Bridge at all, or see any of that stuff moving through the Eel River?
George Dinsmore and I were standing on top of the 12th Street overpass, and we saw Clay Brown's stacks of lumber floating right down the freeway going north.
Jeez. And now tell me about your work at the assessor's office and how that kind of ties into the flood.
Well, during the flood, while it was going on, I went back to work that Monday morning, and they put us in the basement there at the courthouse, and we were running telephone lines where they could get lines in and out, and they'd call in, and I was part of that group that tried to coordinate the transportation between the phone calls coming in and getting them to the Army Corps of Engineers or the Army, then they would get that information to the aircrafts, the pilots and the helicopters and all, and try and get food and supplies to these different places.
Where were the calls coming from that were coming into your station? Were the individuals calling and saying, I'm stuck in...
Pretty much so, yeah. They were calling from, Riddell, Scotia, places that had telephone service, but, and of course, north toward the Arcata Bottoms, and we had a phone call coming, in from Fortuna and Alls and Ferndale. So there was people who could reach us while they were trying to make contact and get as much information to us as we could. But then again, we couldn't handle everything. We do the best we could, but helicopter, they could only take 3 barrels of diesel and things like that. So it was just very slow process.
Sounds like it. And so I'm imagining your command center where you were down in the courthouse.
Yes.
You were in the basement. That's where their emergency command center is today.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Civil defense.
Uh-huh. And did you have like a big map and kind of try and plot what was going on where?
We didn't down there. Basically, the Army took over the supervisor's chambers, and they had their maps and things up there.
Oh, okay. And then you just dealt with these phone calls and trying to make sure that you could link up with people who could help in those different areas?
Right. A lot of people were very discouraged with us, to say the least, because some people we just couldn't help. One guy called in and he said his pickup was going in the water. He needed a helicopter to move his pickup. Well, we never had the big Chinooks or anything like that to move his pickup, so it was just one of those things. We couldn't help him.
Yeah. Now, afterwards, after the flood happened, working in the assessor's office, seems like a lot of people's property was affected by this flood and changed value.
Yeah, very much so. A lot of the people, well, particularly Ferndale, a lot of those dairymen who had been through the 55 flood just walked away and left. They had it. But we had to do something for those people that still had their property. So we put together a plan where we would figure out how much it would cost to clean up the property. If there was sand and silt and mud and trees and stumps and everything like that, figuring out how much it would cost to clear the land, how much it would cost to farm it, and put it back into production. So then we would take that value, subtract that from the value that we had on the property, and give them a discount until the property got back into production. But, Ferndale Bottom, there was no fences or anything left. The cattle were all moved off and everything. In fact, a lot of them were already dead. They had just drowned. Sheep, cows, everything.
And then they did, I think they buried a lot of the cattle over by Centerville Beach.
Yes, they did. They had a big, I believe it was either a D7 or a D8 cat, and dug big trenches, and the Army took the animals in their dump trucks and hauled them and just dumped them in those big, long trenches.
Yeah. Do you have any friends or family who were affected by the flood that you'd like to tell their story?
Oh, yes. There's quite a few of the friends. See, my folks lived at Holmes Flat, and they were my folks, Rebeck's and Greg property, were the only houses that didn't get flooded. So they took in, I think my mom probably had 30 people there at her house at one time. And of course, the electricity was off, and they had no way of keeping the freezer going. So they had plenty of food in the freezer. So she just started cooking. And thank God they had propane gas to cook with. They had no lights, but she always had her old Coleman, or not Coleman, but kerosene lamps and all that she'd brought there years ago. So they had the kerosene lamps and cooked on the propane, her propane stove there. So she put out, of course, she put out great meals anyway, but she fed a lot of people there.
And where did everybody sleep if you had 30 people living in the house?
Well, they didn't all stay there. They had they had logged there recently, and they had a road going back in behind Redcrest. So they took that old road and walked back to Redcrest, and they had the big plywood mill there at the time. And people moved to Redcrest, and then they took over there at Redcrest and started feeding people there at Redcrest.
Was their home affected at all? It sounds like they were pretty high.
No, the water got up to the front steps, but not in their house. So from their front steps over to Bill Rice's front steps, that's how wide the Eel River was there at Holmes Flat, about 2 miles wide.
Wow, that's a different river than what we saw today.
Oh yeah, quite a bit different. You see it here now during the summer. In fact, here just recently, when you look at it and think, my God, how could it possibly be from basically, the highway at Fernbridge to the fairgrounds in Ferndale? How could it possibly be that wide and cover the whole valley, clear over to Lolita and everything? So it was unless you actually was there, it's hard to believe just how much water was in that river.
And then the Ferndale Fairgrounds were kind of an area that was kind of a central staging area.
It was a staging area for Ferndale, yeah. And Cecil Joe Heinley was a defense coordinator over there, civil defense. And they had an airport right there at the fairgrounds. They landed their little planes there at the fairgrounds.
Let's see, what was I going to say? I lost my train of
About people
thought.
camping there?
Yeah, I was thinking about something about the fairgrounds. And then a lot of the farmers brought their cattle over there to the fairgrounds.
Yeah, they did. The ones that were able to get them out ahead of time, why they brought them there to the fairgrounds, because the fairgrounds was high enough out of the water. I don't know how many head of cattle they saved there by taking them to the fairgrounds. But the ones that were out Grizzly Bluff way, they got cut off. And, a lot of those people, unless they could get up Crosley Road, well, I know one of my friends lost a whole herd of sheep because they just drowned.
Now, the civil defense that was in place in Humboldt County then, there's really nothing like that today, is there?
Well, I think they still have the civil defense, but there's better communication now. Everyone has a cell phone, so they've got better readings on the on the rivers and earthquakes and whatever. It's amazing because when we have an earthquake here, I have a son that works in Sacramento, and he called me and says, "How was the earthquake?" So it's that fast. They knew about the earthquake here the other day in just a matter of minutes.
What do you think would be different now if we had a flood of the magnitude of the 1964 flood? What would be different, do you think?
Well, I think people would be better prepared because everyone judged the 64 flood by the 55 flood. The 55 flood there at Holmes Flat only flooded about half the flat. So the people that in the upper half thought, well, we're okay because the 55 flood was a 1,000-year flood. And it didn't make any difference. The 55 flood came and the water kept coming. And, places that had 3 or 4 feet of water in the house in the 55 flood, it went clear over the top of the house in the '64 flood. It was that much more water.
One of the things we've talked about as we've done these interviews is we kind of have this idea in our heads that we think maybe Humboldt County did better during the '64 flood than maybe if something like that had happened to a big city, just because of the number of people here who are used to either farmers who you just can't just go into town when you need a part. You have to figure out how to fix it yourself. There are people who are really good at figuring out problems and problem solving and getting in there with their hands and fixing things. What do you think about that? Do you think people here do better because they're more self-sufficient?
Well, I think so because, like after the flood going over to Ferndale, for example, that's mostly the area that I worked. Those guys were my friends. And to go out there and see them, wading through mud knee deep and trying to shovel out their house with silt and everything, those people had made up their minds that they were going to rebuild or get their dairies back to operation and all. So yeah, there a lot of those people just weren't going to give up, and I think that was instilled in them because their parents before them had gone through like the 1937 flood. They went, excuse me, they went through that flood, so they knew what that was like, and they just kept building from that experience and the smaller floods that hit. So they knew the people, particularly the lower part of the Eel River there, they knew that when that water was coming, that they better get out, and a lot of them did. Some of them that weren't ready, they didn't make it, and those are the ones that left the area too.
Yeah. Let's see. Any questions you guys have?
I have a couple questions. Well, I wanted to ask you, did you know Buddy Hadley that was killed in that crash?
Yes, I did. That was the sad part. When they brought the pilot in over here at the airport, why he was the only one that made it out of the 7.
I wanted to ask you to describe what that pilot looked like. He must have been freezing to death.
Oh, he was just he was just really, really shook up and shivering. It was, I mean, he I hate to say it, but to me, I didn't know whether he was going to make it or not.
I've been reading a lot of the newspapers, Roy, from 1964, and Helge Paulson gets mentioned a lot. You have anything to say about him?
Who?
Helge Paulson? I thought he was like the...
Oh, Helge.
Yeah.
Helge Paulson, he was the assessor, yes.
Anything to say about him? Because he gets mentioned a lot in the papers.
Yeah, well, he was the one that sent us appraisers out, and we had to start making adjustments on the properties. So a lot of them we just went out and saw that the houses and barns and everything was just completely destroyed. So we just wiped off all the improvement values and just left a minimum land value on.
Did you also know Bud Hansen that died in the first...
No, I didn't know Bud. I knew who he was over at Ferndale there, and some of the people that were with him on that flight. There were things that happened there that they were probably flying in very bad weather and maybe shouldn't have been flying, but when people need help, you give them all the help you can, and I think maybe they were just pushing it a little bit too much to be in a safe condition. Those power lines going across that river after the '64 flood, when the pilots were flying in and out, with PG&E and all, they had a map of Humboldt County, and one of the maps, and there was other guys, not only myself, but what we did, because I'm pretty well familiar with Humboldt County and where those power lines go, I would put a big X on the river where those power lines cross the river, so that people or the pilots would know where those power lines were, because we sure didn't need any more pilots or helicopters or planes hitting those power lines and going down.
Yeah, you know, it's amazing to me that it seems like not one of those helicopters went out without a local pilot.
Well, Bunny should have known about that power line up at McCann, but you know, I don't know whether he was working with the pilots or not. I don't know the situation, but I know that they did hit that power line, and that was all it took. It was just that one power line.
One more thing about this civil defense. I was talking to Cliff Clendenin the other day, saying that there was an earthquake when he was chairman of the Board of Supervisors for a few weeks one time, and as soon as there was a earthquake, he was immediately called and sort of in charge of the I guess the rescue if there was going to be anything. And it looked like the Board of Supervisors, the chairman of the Board of Supervisors, his name was Robertson, at the time, was in charge of civil defense by default.
Actually, Norm was not in charge. I'm trying to think of the fellow that was in charge of civil defense, but it 50 years is quite a while to think back. But Norm Robinson was the chairman of the Board of Supervisors at that particular time. But I can't remember the name of the guy that was actually the head of defense, civil defense there. But he was in the basement working there with us. But Norm and Norm and Guy Rusher and Mel Borellis and those guys were the supervisors, and they were working with the Army, the ones that were doing the flying and everything in the supervisors' chambers.
It said in the newspaper that Buddy Hadley had been a supervisor in years before he was killed. Do you remember that?
No, I don't remember Bunny ever being a supervisor, but he could have. I don't know.
Yeah, it said in the paper he was. It also said he was the head of the local civil defense, I guess you call it the air squadron or the...
Well, I would imagine he probably was part of the air. Well, I wouldn't call it air, not the civil air defense.
Civil air defense.
Yeah, civilian air. He was part of that, yes, because he was a pilot. But there was a lot of those guys that I remember. Jim Meade came up here, brought his helicopters up and worked, and Bill Getz was another one that flew. Gene Rothland, Jim Mortison, Gene Rothland. Just a whole bunch of guys who were flying at that time.
Was Dr. Judela flying at that time?
No, Dr. Judela was not here yet. He was still back in Nevada.
Did you know, what's his name? Les Pierce that ran the...
His Les's nephew Alan and I worked together in the assessor's office, and I knew Les, and he was really one of the first pilots in Humboldt County as far as flying these modern day aircraft and helicopters and all. But
I think his wife Helen helped to do the scheduling for some of the relief efforts.
She might have. I can't remember all of the people that were involved in it. I mean, everyone did their part. That was for sure. They all pulled together and did what they could to work with civil defense, and each community had a person that was pretty much headed the civil defense. Like the smaller communities, they needed someone they could go to, and a lot of stuff had to be signed for and all, and they needed someone to take charge.
let me ask you about two other people. There was a guy named Zebo, I think.
Oh, Dave Zebo, yeah. Well, he was the he was also a pilot, and he was in charge of the McKinleyville Eureka Arcata Airport at that time. He was in charge of the airport. Yeah, Dave did quite a job coordinating the big supply planes that brought supplies in by air to the Arcata Airport.
The big C-124s, I saw the pictures.
Yes.
What about Kay Chaffee? Did you know her?
Oh, yeah. You know, she was a neat lady. In fact, she is a neat lady. She's still alive. And she used to fly planes, once they were built, she'd fly them across the United States and deliver them to different airports for the guys. You know, she was Civil Air you betcha. She was a good gal.
That'll do it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was living at Holmes Flat in the 1937 flood, and we went down after the flood went down and helped clean up a couple of houses there in Pepperwood, and went through that one. I went through the 55. We had the Standard Oil plant there at Southwark at the time, my brother, and the highway was really torn up in 55 too. So but like I say, that 64, that really, that was the flood of all floods, that's for darn sure. I had to take a load of propane tanks there from South Fork, and we couldn't get up through Bull Creek, so I had to go around through Ferndale to Petrolia and Honeydew. I think it took me 14 hours to make that trip.
Do you know anything about the Blue Slide Road and using that after the flood?
Oh yeah, that was the main highway. They had to go. They went through Ferndale and Blue Slide, and they said Riddell was cut off. Well, Riddell was not cut off because they could go from Ferndale up over the Wildcat, across Bear River Ridge, and come down Monument into Riddell. But no one really knew about that road, only the old farmers out there in that area. But Petrolia and Honeydew got hit harder in the 55 flood than they did in the 64, because the 55 flood, that storm hung up right over the Kings Range and just dumped everything right in Mattole and Honeydew. So that was the worst flood for them than the 64 flood.
Honeydew's I think the wettest spot in Humboldt County.
It is. They get over 100 inches of rain. I probably won't make it this year, but they do. They get a slug of rain, that's for sure.
I like that.
Okay.
Slug of rain.
Slug of rain.
Okay, hey, you're going to be remembered for that line.